Hello everybody, I hope you had a great week. So today's lecture is going to focus on pre-assessment and the different purposes for pre-assessment. As we talked about in our last video, we're going to be breaking down the course in terms of the point of view of the student and in terms of the point of view of the teacher. Let's look at what this means in terms of pre-assessment. Pre-assessment is a time where the teacher is going to be focusing on things like prior knowledge, students' motivation, prerequisite skills, the standards, the order in which things are going to be taught, and also conceptualizing how they're going to evaluate the learning. In terms of the student, this is the time where the student will be engaging in forethought. In other words, they will be inventorying what they know. They will be buying into the motivation for learning this, and they will be also trying to assimilate this new learning into the schema that they've already developed in prior lessons or in prior years. In order to look at pre-assessment in a more detailed way, let's break this down into the what, why, and how of pre-assessment. As far as the what of pre-assessment, we want to look at what experiences and skill sets do students bring with them when entering your class. In terms of the why, we want to ask ourselves, why do we care about students' current intellectual skills, attitudes, and motivation? Finally, in terms of the how, we want to ask ourselves, how do we elicit students' prior learning experiences and conceptions? Let's start with the what. The what in pre-assessment deals with looking at students' prior learning experiences, beliefs, and attitudes towards the topic, and students' prior knowledge of the topics and their skills in relation to those topics. So looking at the what is really the first place where we start. We want to identify students' prior skill sets and knowledge and begin with the current unit of design and then design backwards to identify the prerequisite knowledge and skill sets needed for students to do well. One way to do this is by looking at the standards that you use for your particular discipline. For example, for the Math Common Core standards, you can look at the previous year or other areas of the same domain. You can also look at the standards progressions that were developed by the writers of the standards to give teachers insights on how the topics were connected to one another when they were designed. If you have access to curriculum packages or to any other resources that come with the district's adoption or your school's adoption, you can also get a very clear idea of what students were exposed to in previous chapters or units. The why of pre-assessment should be just as important to the learner as it is to you, the teacher. During this time, students need to self-inventory their own understanding of the topic and their motivation for learning this topic. They should also have an opportunity to engage in metacognition so they can prepare themselves to learn the new knowledge. During the time that the students are able to reflect on their own motivation and beliefs about a particular topic or discipline, it's also time for you, the teacher, to help them alter any misconceptions that they may have about their own ability to engage in the topic. This is a good time to begin to brainstorm ways that you can make the instruction more aligned with real-world problems, to make it more meaningful to the students, to engage in culturally responsive teaching, and also to begin to think of ways to scaffold the learning so that students feel more successful at the end when they achieve their goals. This step is especially important when we think about self-regulation learning. Our ultimate goal for students is for them to become lifelong learners. Lifelong learners will engage in self-regulation. Ultimately, they will be the ones responsible for being able to understand when they know something and when they need more practice, and also what their own learning process will be. To summarize, teachers need to look at students' intellectual skills so that they can plan their units or their instruction according to the students' needs. We want to clear up misconceptions and also establish a foundation onto which new learning can attach itself. In order to do this, there are several things that teachers should consider. One should be, what should the learners achieve at the end of the new instructional period? What are the prerequisite skills that are needed in order for students to be successful in learning these topics? What do students already know in these topics? And what is the depth of the instruction and assessment on these topics? The last question is, how do we engage in pre-assessment? When we're engaging in pre-assessment, we want to think about the constructs that are elicited. And we're going to talk about constructs in more detail in the next lecture. Also, we want to make sure that we have students engage in behaviors that are aligned with the constructs that we want to measure. I'm going to go ahead and link the lecture that deals with constructs right here so that you can fast forward if you'd like. But since constructs are discussed in depth in the next lecture, I want to go ahead and just hold off on the explanation during this video. So let's start going through the steps of assessment so you can have an idea of what we would do. The first steps of pre-assessment in this diagram appear to be linear, and they are for the most part, but there is a little bit of an overlap where it's unclear which step happens first or before another one, as we'll see in a little bit, but for the most part they follow this general process. The first thing we want to do when we're trying to go towards assessment is identifying the guide that is going to be giving us information about what we're going to be teaching. Typically, if you're English language arts teacher or a math teacher, you're going to be using the Common Core State Standards. If you are a dance teacher or a foreign language teacher or a music teacher, you would have your own blueprints. A lot of the fine arts have their own blueprints that discuss in detail what should be studied or what topics should be covered during various courses. Same with foreign language teachers. The social studies teachers might be using components of the English language arts Common Core State Standards, same as the science teachers, but then they also have other state documents that might guide their work as well. So really going into what you know about what guides your work and your curriculum in your classroom is most important. You also want to keep in mind anything that your particular school or site values in terms of curriculum. So anything that would be expected to guide your instruction is included in this first step. As a reminder, all of these Google Slides are linked in the description box below. And if you click on the link that you see here, you'll be able to go straight to the New York State Education Department, and you'll be able to click where it says Standards and Curriculum. Here, you will be able to get any blueprints that you may need. So for example, social studies, you can click here and go straight to what the framework is, and looking at how this is aligned with what you're teaching, aligned with your textbooks, etc. Also keep in mind that there is the immersion of the New York State Next Generation English Language Arts and Mathematics Learning Standards. What these are a revised version of the Common Core State Standards, and just helping teachers to unpack the standards as they are written. So you might want to take a look at this eventually, if not right away. Again, all these links are in the description box below, as well as in the Google Slides, which are also linked in the description box below. The other thing that you want to think about is the rationale for learning this. And the rationale is a worldwide view of why this should ever be learned. So here are some examples of rationale. And when you're looking at the rationale, you want to think about discipline-specific content that is important to learn for its own merit. It shouldn't just be seen as knowledge that you're acquiring so that it can propagate future learning. It's not knowledge that should be acquired so that one day you can use it as prior knowledge. So, for example, the rationale for reading nonfiction could be for students to be able to evaluate sources and biases and also guide in self-learning in order to read to learn instead of just learn to read. Learning about the seasons of the year is not just because it's part of the science curriculum. The rationale for learning about the seasons is that it is a predictable phenomenon that's based on physics and the Earth's rotation in the universe. It's based on science and it's not random. The purpose for you taking an assessment design course is not only because it's part of your teaching and credentialing process, but it's really so that you can make clear inferences about what your students understand and that you can make adjustments to your own instruction. That's the big idea. The rationale for executing a pirouette is not just because it's on some objective list for your school. The rationale for executing a pirouette might be that pirouettes are a basic element of choreography that's used in all levels of dance, from a beginning student all the way to a professional artist. So when we're looking at the rationale, you want to think of the worldwide view of why should anybody ever have to learn these particular things. When establishing the rationale for your topic, you can look at your resources, but another good practice to start to get into and way to expand your career is to actually look at major contributors of the field. So for example, if I'm teaching a psychology course and the students are having to learn the stages of cognitive development, the rationale for ever learning this is that we want teachers to understand that all humans pass through cognitive developmental stages, and that if you understand your student's developmental stage, it can help you plan more effective lessons. Now, I can say that out of my own merit, but it is much more powerful and it gives my pedagogy or my purpose credibility if I were to actually cite the person that came up with these ideas. In this instance, it would have been Piaget. As a math teacher, I may say that if I am teaching a class on balancing equations, that the rationale to learn balancing equations is that equilibrium is the meaning and accounting of the same quantity, which can be written or expressed in a variety of ways. Things can be substituted into being a sameness. It's not just an operational sign. An equal sign means more than just is or the result of. Okay, there's more to that meaning. Now, I can say that because I have been teaching for a long time, but ultimately what I should do is I should actually credit the person who has dedicated their time and their career to looking at what it means for students to actually be balancing equations and how it lends itself to a variety of future topics and disciplines, right? They have more credibility than I. So in this case, I could go and cite Bayer's work in 1976. It is good practice for teachers to know the major contributors to their discipline. And one easy way to do that is just by going into a database. One easy database to go into is Google Scholar. You just simply go into whatever web browser and type in Google Scholar, and you'll get a specialized Google search engine that will just look at academic articles. If you had access to your Hunter database or any other college database that you're used to using, another great database to use is Education Source Complete. Education Source Complete will give you a more refined search versus Google Scholar, which will return pretty much anything. It just depends on what you prefer to do. Okay, so those are both really great resources. I will link information about Google Scholar and Education Source Complete in the description box below as well. The next step in pre-assessment is to look at what you're supposed to teach and the rationale and identify very broad and overarching goals. These are called abstract or general goals. When you're making decisions about these general abstract learning goals, you want to think about the major kinds of learning that you expect students to achieve. And these major kinds of learning should be expressed in very general terms focused on student learning. You're not looking for measurable verbs in this instance. You're looking for sort of unobservable verbs at this point. Examples of abstract goals may use verbs like to know, to use, to analyze, to express. None of these things can actually be seen. Like, it's different than being able to see writing or being able to recite or being able to solve. Okay, those are very different verbs. These are much more abstract. So, for example, an abstract general goal for an American literature class is just to know basic facts about American literature. To be able to use conventions of poetry and poetic techniques in writing, to analyze texts for bias or propaganda, or to express oneself effectively in spoken language. Those are very broad and abstract. There's nothing that we can actually see that would be evidence that students know anything. When we get into specific learning objectives, we will speak in more detail about measurable verbs that will actually elicit evidence. Identifying abstract goals in advance helps the teacher interpret the standards and also select the most important concepts of the standards in advance. In that way, instruction can focus in on what has been deemed most important in advance. The next step in assessment is to develop a general task and also decide in which order the lessons should appear. When we're developing a task, there are several things that you should consider, besides what we've already discussed, which are the standards, any other guiding documents that might be important, the rationale, and the focus of your instruction, what you have deemed to be most important. We also want to think about what type of thinking that the students will be engaged in during the unit, and we also want to look at how rigorous the tasks will be. Let's break Bloom's taxonomy, which is a taxonomy that categorizes thinking, and Norman Webb's depth of knowledge, which is a taxonomy that categorizes complexity or rigor of a task in more detail. Another way to differentiate process is by using different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I'm going to quickly go over the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but ultimately what I want you to take away is that Bloom's taxonomy describes students' engagement. Another way to say that is student thinking. This is very different than describing task rigor. So Bloom's is student thinking.
There's actually two Bloom's versions of Bloom's taxonomy. There's the original and there's the revised. Either case, Bloom's taxonomy describes students' engagement. So how much are the students thinking? How much are the students doing? Students don't need to proceed through the levels of Bloom's linearly, but sometimes higher levels do incorporate elements of lower levels to be able to achieve them. This is the original Bloom's taxonomy. It was developed in 1956 by Benjamin Bloom, and it was originally developed to classify educational goals for performance evaluation in children, but then it kind of was used more broadly to identify the thinking that the students were engaging in. So if you kind of look at the very bottom, it started off with knowledge, and then that was sort of like the very basic level of thinking. And then as you proceeded up this sort of like pyramid, it would get more complex. So it started off with knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. If you notice, knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, all these are nouns. Since we wanted to think of it as the student was actually engaging in the learning, one of Bloom's students, Lauren Anderson, decided to revise classification from nouns to verbs in the attempt to describe the active engagement, the active thinking of the student. So the student is describing student thinking. And so they changed the words from the original Bloom's to these verbs, which are at the very bottom level is remembering. Okay, that's the lowest level of engagement. And then understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating is at the very top. These are ways that you can think about, what am I having my students do?
That either knowledge standards or assessments require. DOK describes the task, not the thinking. Bloom's describes the thinking. DOK describes the task. The DOK of the problem-solving task should be considered when you're planning the task. So looking to see where in the DOK scale does a task fall. When we're looking at DOK, we're looking at the depth and complexity of a task, not the difficulty. The difficulty speaks more to the thinking or the Bloom's level. Therefore, the verbs may or may not point to the DOK level. It's what comes after the verb that is the best indicator of rigor. So when you're looking at this, you want to think about how much does the student need to know the content in order to be able to respond. And since you're trying to evaluate to what extent of the content the student has had access to thus far, how are you going to use this framework for planning? DOK has 4 levels of complexity, and they go from a very simple task to something that requires a lot more planning. Because it is so dependent on previously taught skills, it will likely have to be introduced to students from a low DOK level to a higher DOK level linearly. So these are the 4 levels of DOK. I will say that these names, in my opinion, are very deceiving because they have the word thinking, and I just got done telling you that this has nothing to do with thinking. Let's look at examples so that I can kind of show you a little bit better of what is meant here. This is a common graphic organizer that's been seen throughout the DOE. I always tell new teachers, always make sure that whatever you do in a classroom is aligned with your school's mission and your school's requirements, right? However, I can tell you, as somebody who's been in education for a very long time and had to implement a lot of programs, that a lot of the times these ideas get changed to suit a district or a school several times. So while this is being used as a way to differentiate, really it should not be used. The verbs do not tell you how complex a task is. It tells you the type of thinking that's there, perhaps, but not the complexity of the task. Let me show you an example. Here, I have 3 activities. Notice that they all have the same verb. They all use the verb describe. In the first DOK, the student is just asked to describe 3 characteristics of metamorphic rocks. So that's a simple recall. They should be able to do that. Not a problem. List it out. The DOK2 also uses the word describe, but it says describe the difference between metamorphic rocks and igneous rocks. So a student needs to know more than one thing and be able to organize it. So they need to know what metamorphic rocks are and their characteristics, and they need to know what igneous rocks are and their characteristics, and then they have to be able to compare and contrast the two. The third example here also uses the word describe. It says, describe a model that you might use to represent the relationships that exist between the rock cycle. For this situation, you need to know about metamorphic rocks, you need to know about igneous rocks, and you need to know about sedimentary rocks. And you need to understand the rock cycle so that you create your own representation of the relationships between all these different types of rocks. So do you see how the third activity requires a lot more knowledge and planning and making connections between these things? It's going to take a student a lot longer to do the third activity than just simply naming 3 characteristics of one type of rock. So that's the difference. It's really how much goes into the task. How rigorous is it? What is a DOK1 task? So that's just simple recall of information. It doesn't matter if it's recall of multiplication tables, if it's recall of the elements on a periodic table. It doesn't matter if it's the recall of the Krebs cycle in biochem. It's just recall. One is more difficult than the other, but DOK is not about difficulty, it's about complexity. An example for DOK 1 at maybe a 3rd grade level, and this is very similar to an example we did earlier, is 47 people have to travel to a field trip, 8 people can ride in a van. How many vans will they need to take? So this is a simple division problem. They take the people and they figure out that 47 divided by 8 is going to have some leftovers. So then we're going to need 6 vans total. So simple problem, 1 simple task. A DOK2 task includes more engagement than just simple recall, and it requires the students to make some decisions about how to approach a problem. So a compare-contrast using a Venn diagram is a level 2 task. Identifying major events and summarizing them might be a level 2 task. Multi-step problems might be a level 2 task. Cause and effect. Moving with the same scenario that I used in the DOK1 task, here I have 47 people have to travel to a field trip. If 8 people can ride a van, how much money will the school have to pay the van company if the vans cost $106 to rent? So what's here? First, they need to complete the regular division problem that they had to do in the DOK1, figure out they needed 6 vans, and then multiply the number of vans by $106, or add it up 6 times, whatever they decided to do. But they had to come up with an idea of what would go first, what would go next, what's my plan here in order to solve this. Ultimately, what are they doing? They're working with order of operations. And actually, they're working with order of operations, but PEMDAS doesn't apply, because here they had to divide first and then multiply. Strategic thinking is the name of DOK3, and this requires a deep understanding, more demanding reasoning, developing a plan or sequence to approach a problem. So an example would be a multi-step problem and provide a mathematical explanation that just justifies an answer, but it can't just be a 2-step problem with a mathematical response. It has to be quite a bit involved. Let me show you what a level 3 task would be using that same information that we just used with the bus scenario or the van scenario. 47 students, 2 teachers, and 5 chaperones will be going on a field trip to a lab located 50 miles away. The school can rent vans for $106 plus 37 cents per mile, which can accommodate 8 people, including the driver. The school can also rent a bus for $215 plus 99 cents per mile, which can accommodate 16 people, including the driver. What type of vehicle or combination of vehicles could the school order for the field trip to send the students? Which way would be the most economical? So this problem has nothing more than division, multiplication, and addition. That's all it has. The skills in themselves are not difficult. What this problem is it's complex. The student has to derive a plan in order to solve this problem. That plan to approach this problem is what makes it a DOK3, not the individual skills within this problem. Another thing about DOK3 is that it should be based on like real life events. There can be more than one answer, in certain circumstances. Here, it says what type of vehicle or combination of vehicles. Like there could be different ways that the students could combine them. Of course, there's only one way that would be most economical, but again, it would depend on if you're just dealing with vehicles, if you're just dealing with vans or buses. So it just kind of depends on how you wanted to work through this. This DOK 3, for adults, this is going to take us, a while to do. A third grader, this is going to take them a week, easily, because they're going to have to think about how they're going to approach the problem. If you're dealing with gifted students, they're just throwing back those naked number problems and those easy word problems like it's nothing. Give them a DOK 3 task that's going to allow them to slow them down, allow them to use various strategies. You could also say, I want you to use 2 POLYA strategies to show this. Okay, all those things are making this more complex for the student, but it's still sticking to the same standard. You can also tier with DOK levels too. The last type is called extended thinking. And really the main difference between the strategic thinking level 3 and the extended thinking level 4 is the amount of time that a student has to go in and interact with that activity. For example, I would say that the lesson plan that you're going to do for this class is a level 4 DOK. Because you're going to have to go in and use the standards and the progressions and figure out what types of manipulatives might be best for the lesson that you want to do, what kind of assessment you're going to do. Like you're going to have to pull from all these different things that we've discussed in order to do the work. It's also something that teachers are having to do in real life. It requires choice. You get to decide what you want to teach. So these kind of situations are our DOK level 4. I had one teacher that I coached that was a 5th grade teacher that at the end of the year, he did a DOK 4 after the testing period was over. And what he did is he assigned each one of the students in the class a car, a certain type of car. So they had the year, make, and model of a car. They had to go in and research what the gas mileage was for a car. And then he would tell the students, okay, you and your families are all driving from New York to Disneyland. You need to use a map, figure out how long it's going to take you to get there, figure out the gas mileage will last you for a tank of gas, where you're going to fuel up, where you're going to spend the night, and you need to stay below, I don't know, it's like $5,000. That task is a real life task. Somebody would do that if they were going to go from New York and vacation in Disneyland. Well, it's going to take any person a while to do because it requires a lot of research, and you're going to have to be working with that task for a while. But it's going to take a 5th grader weeks to do. So that kind of stuff is a level 4 DOK. It's very complex. It's not necessarily difficult, it's just very complex to do. As a quick review, Bloom's taxonomy describes thinking, and Webb's depths of knowledge, DOK, describes the task. When you start to categorize your task, or your products that you want students to create, you need to think about how much organization will be required to complete that task. How rigorous is that task work-wise? Okay, the level of thought in that task is not indicative of anything in Webb's DOK. It's only relevant when using Bloom's taxonomy. I have another DOK example that just works with kindergarten, 1st grade type of activities with seeds and pots and, kind of mixing science with mathematics. Here, you can just kind of thumb through it yourself. Once you've decided on what type of tasks would fit your unit, the next thing to do is to put them in a logical order. This logical order is called a learning progression. Learning progressions are often the result of just empirical research on the structure of expertise in a discipline and how that learning typically occurs. A lot of teachers gain insight on the learning progression from the order that things may appear in a textbook. For those of you that may not use typical textbook and have to piece resources together yourself, you might want to look at what progressions have already been established, either through the Common Core state standards, through any of the resources, through like Engage New York, or through your school. You might want to look at curriculum mapping that has happened at the school, vertical and lateral alignments for the discipline, and looking at how concepts are sort of fit together so that you have coherence throughout the discipline. The criteria for a progression is just kind of looking at the sub-skills or knowledge that is needed in order to meet the next goal. So making sure that you're creating sort of a stepwise pathway so that students can build on prior knowledge and create a more comprehensive outlook on the discipline by having their prior knowledge grasp onto existing knowledge, and this continuing to propagate. So for example, if you were looking at the learning goals and sub-goals for understanding the functions of the plant root system, understand is that abstract goal. You want students to maybe start by identifying the anatomy of the roots and then comparing different types of roots once you've learned the anatomy of them, and then describing the different functions of the root structure, and then being able to explain how each part of the root structure works in order to support plant growth. So there's definitely a linear progression that students would engage in to be able to understand the entire concept. Another way to think of the learning progression is sort of like a unit plan or a series of daily lesson plans. The daily lesson plans should be aligned so that the next lesson builds upon a previous lesson. So that's really all the learning progression is just what is the order that you will expect the learning to occur. In our next lecture, we will look at specific learning objectives and start to operationalize constructs. So that's it for today, for this week's lecture. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye!